Well, thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you to everyone here. I've been to this church, I've been down here once before, and it's a real privilege to be back. Thank you very much to those who've turned out early, including those who have lots of really big jobs to do later, and our MP, and thank you for that. And just say we do pray for you, because this is such a hard time and so difficult. And I wanted to say a few things just about leadership in hard times. I know that Crawley has been particularly hard hit by the process of the lockdown because of the loss of international travel through Gatwick, which is obviously one of the main generators of the economy round here. And it's phenomenal that there's a sense from what I'm hearing of the community coming together and supporting each other. But for that to happen, there has to be leadership. And leadership is one of those things that we stopped talking about for a while and are now beginning to talk about again. Because as we look around, not only this country, but across Europe, we see the difference, but we see lots of styles of leadership, and we see the difference between effective and ineffective leadership. That's not any kind of comment about anyone, by the way. It's just we would all have examples. If I'm going to be political, which I'm not, I will wave a hand, right? But I am really not. There are no subtexts here. I don't do conspiracy. I'm just not good at it. But we've also seen the difference between effective leadership that is fundamentally wicked and effective leadership that is fundamentally heroic. And we're seeing that at the moment. And that is a very striking thing to observe. And I want to talk a little about leadership in hard times and some of the things it means. I'm going to start with talking about people, to use Chamberlain's expression in 1938, in countries far away of which we know little. And one of them in particular, there's two countries I'm going to talk about. One is South Sudan, and the other is DRC. And when I was first in this job, I went to, I made a point of doing what you do as a vicar in any new job, is you visit all the senior leaders in the place where you are. I'm sure you did the same. You go to their homes and you sit down with them and you listen to what it's like. But it's a little more complicated in the Anglican Communion because we have 41 senior leaders, and they are in 41 separate countries on all the continents of the earth except for Antarctica. The reason they're not in Antarctica is that Antarctica falls under my personal jurisdiction. Little did you know that you're looking at the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is also bishop for the Falkland Islands, South Georgia, and the Antarctic. If anyone feels like taking on a role on my behalf in the Antarctic, you're welcome. And we traveled, Caroline and I, my wife and I, traveled around all the provinces. And out of that, she got a call a little while later from an archbishop who said, would you come and join and be part of a retreat for bishops' wives? And this was in sub-Saharan Africa. And she thought, after a bit of thinking and prayer, she thought, well, all right. So about a week before she went, he said, now this, he rang up again and said, she's known as Mama Lambeth in many parts of Africa. He said, Mama Lambeth, now this retreat you're leading next week. And so, having dealt with the inevitable sense of panic, she went and she took a retreat for the spouses of the bishops. And then out of that, she went to a couple of other places, and out of that has developed a work which is called Women on the Front Line, because she's focused on places of conflict, struggle, and real issues. She goes to, for instance, one of her trips, she's been to South Sudan a number of times in the midst of the civil war, and it's the only time I've heard her in the midst of one of these trips be really upset. On her second trip, she rang me up and she was in tears and she said, "I've made the most dreadful mistake." I said, "What have you done?" I couldn't think she was likely to have done. She's quite experienced in this stuff. And she said, "I left the name labels for the people. There were 50 bishops' wives coming. I left the name labels behind. And so I asked them to write their names on Post-it notes. And 75% of them, of the bishops' wives, are completely illiterate, even in their own language. Their husbands all have at least graduate degrees, but you don't educate women, of course. So, but they have married, usually when someone's at theological college, that person's gone on and been a vicar, and they just get the duties of a vicar's wife. In this country, it doesn't happen that way any longer. People have more choice. There's no choice there. And then the husband gets made a bishop eventually, perhaps after a couple of jobs. And they have to be responsible for the women's ministry across a huge area and all the schools and the clinics, often with great wisdom and great knowledge, but no formal training, and in many cases, not even a day's education in their entire lives. And what Women on the Front Line is doing, it's a small team that they will go out and spend a week. It's very cross-cultural. There's a number of women who travel in the team who I've never been on one, obviously, because I don't qualify, shall we say. I'm not a woman. And they travel out together and they spend the first few days in a retreat, not teaching people anything in particular except about their call from God, who loves them and not just their husband. That when God calls someone to a particular place, and this is true for clergy and laity, he doesn't just call that person. God doesn't forget that they've got family. He knows they've got family. And God calls each of them, loves each of them, and commissions each of them to the ministry they're to have. It could be, in this country, it could be just getting on with your job. It could be all kinds of things. But the point that they get across on Women on the Front Line is they are equipped to be the very best they can be by the God who loves them and reaches out to them. So at the heart of it is saying you too can know and know that you can know God and know that you're loved by God. And the interesting thing about that is it doesn't only apply in places like South Sudan. So many people, there may be people here who believe in God, but somehow feel that they're not fit to be or don't qualify to be or aren't the right kind of person to be personally loved by God through Jesus Christ and reached out to with a God who says, I know you, I know all the best bits about you, I know all the worst bits about you, and I love you. That's the first step. It is affirming that whatever you do, whether you're on the streets, through to being an MP or whatever it happens to be, you are called to be someone who is a channel for the love of God, even if as yet you don't even know the God who is going to make you a channel of his love. And that's the extraordinary thing. He looks on people who are completely unqualified for the job they're doing. I mean, look at me. And look at what the papers say about me. Totally unqualified for the job he does. Well, who reads the Spectator and the Telegraph anyway? And the Times and the Guardian. Oh, well, let's move on from that section. The present circumstances, the circumstances of the last 2 years have been extraordinary, terrifying. I was talking to someone yesterday who in 2019 had gone into a new job in a situation of chaos that she went into it in. And on the same day, a month after she got the job and started the job, it's a very senior public job, a month after she started on, in the morning, she was told she had breast cancer. And in the afternoon, her mother was told she had cancer. And so she was dealing with her mortality, a team in a huge public-facing job that was under unbelievable pressure in a new role that she hadn't had time to get used to, and she had to deal with it all at once. And so we talked there about leadership and about the love of God. But we looked back, this was in 2019, and she said at one point, at that point, I thought that was the worst year of my life. But I think we're in darker times now. Crises don't give us warning. How many of us would have thought we'd be in a position of some kind of leadership or responsibility in the circumstances of today or the last 2 years? But we're not the first generation to face that. On November the 14th, 1940, Coventry was bombed very, very heavily. Even it was bombed so heavily that the Germans had a word for it, which I've heard used in Germany to this day, which is to Coventrate something. And so I was in Germany a few years ago, and the person I was meeting turned up late. He said, "I'm so sorry for being so late, but I Coventrated the car last night." In other words, he wrote it off. And the cathedral was bombed. I expect from 10,000 feet, a cathedral roof looks pretty similar to a factory roof, and they were just blitzing the whole place, something that we are so familiar with at this very moment. And the dean of the cathedral, called provost in those days, in the morning, he stood in the ruins, smoking ruins, the smoke from the city around him, and he took some burnt wood and wrote behind the high altar, "Father, forgive." And someone said to him, "Don't you mean, Father, forgive them?" And he said, "No, because the Bible tells us that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." All. And on Christmas Day, 6 weeks later, he said on the BBC that he was committed to building after the war a kinder, simpler, more Christ-child-like world. Leadership is about responding with knowledge of what we should do and doing the right thing. But where do we find the strength in times of crisis, of fear like this? How do we set the example? Third story and last story. A dear friend of mine, Bishop Desiree Mukanawa, in the city of Goma in the eastern DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. I've known him since 2005. In 2009, I was visiting him before I was Archbishop. I was working up in Liverpool at the time. And I went to Goma. It was under siege at the time. You could get in across the Rwandan border. It's on the border. You could get in that way. There was no one going in. There was a big queue coming out. There's no one going in. And I went to see the DFID office, as it then was, now part of the Foreign Office. And just to give you an example, it was about 200 yards from the frontier. And when we went in, the head of DFID there, who had a very dry sense of humour, said there was a row of trainers. And I said, "You do a lot of running here?" He said, no, it's the evacuation instructions that we have here. If we need to evacuate, put on a pair of trainers, go out the front door, turn right and run like hell until you're across the border. So that was evacuation. They were right on the border. But Desiree, he wasn't a bishop then, he was a parish priest. We went out between the lines and were bringing some refugees down from the hills. I spent about a week there. He was made a bishop a few years later. His church still had a shell hole in the wall where it had been holed during the bombardment. And in his diocese, he used to go out into areas controlled by the militias, and 137 militias in the area, and he would get the child soldiers together. And they'd have a football competition against other militias' child soldiers in the morning. He and his wife would look after the boys and the girls. Many of the girls had been sexually abused or raped. And over lunch, and they'd do an Alpha course, they'd teach them about Jesus, and in the afternoon they teach them about peace building and peacemaking. And when I was with him last time, we went to a refugee camp. It was a terrible place. And I said to him, there were about 20,000 people there, 250,000 refugees in the area. And I said, how do you manage, Desiree? What do you do? He said, I do what God enables me to do, and the rest is his problem. The impact that he and Claudeline, his wife, had and continue to have is testimony to the transformation that brave individuals can achieve in local contexts. He was a dear friend. He died of COVID 18 months ago. The whole city turned out for his funeral, a city that is not particularly Anglican, but they knew the love of God when they saw it. That is what leadership is called to today. To know its limits, to do all it can with the resources God gives. But how do we do that? We do that by, first of all, knowing the God who equips us. And doing that is so simple. It is turning to God, acknowledging our need, and inviting him to lead and be in charge of our lives. Confessing our failures, our weakness, what the Bible calls our sin, and saying, come in and be in charge. It's not complicated. Sounds too easy to be true. It's one of the very few things, in fact, the only thing that I know in this world where when it sounds too good to be true, it isn't too good to be true. It is true, and it is good. In your huge responsibilities, in many cases, local responsibilities in others, just things you have to do day to day. Leading a country and an area that's gone through a hard time now needs to recover. Open your hearts to the resources of God. And as you do so, you will find what Desiree found. The peace of God, the strength of God, the power of God. Thank you.